Welcome back. And if I go to start on my slides, contract strategy brackets using NEC, because we're going to be sort of comparing other contracts for civil engineers and in part 3. So quick reminder of the overall aims. It's to give you knowledge on different contract strategies, with the intention that you can intelligently contribute to the development of a good contract strategy. And that ultimately leads to projects being more successful, or the contracts which make up projects being more successful. And in terms of the overall program, we're roughly on schedule, pretty much. Contract strategy choices, focusing primarily on the main payment options. So we've looked at the principles, the concepts. We've looked at the NEC family of contracts. We did a quick comparison with other members of the family and what's available. And now we're going to look at the contract strategy options. And then in the 22nd and 29th, we're going to probably be finishing off the above and looking at the secondary options, and then finally the last little bits of the contract data entries. So in today's agenda, we're startup, objectives, agendas, today's agenda and the previous one. Quick reminder of the ground rules, quick review of key slides. Then the main event is the 5 main payment options, the first 5 main payment options. And the reason why I'm not looking at the 6th is because I'm going to consider them with other forms of management contracts. And the reason there's a question mark there is because this is a one-off course, if you like, and I'm not absolutely sure of my timing. So I'm not absolutely sure if we'll get there, or if we get there, whether we'll have sufficient time to cover it all or not. But what I do hope to do is briefly cover the early contractor involvement types that you have. In terms of ground rules, it is being recorded, so hopefully others can watch it with a link. It's really nice to have at least one camera on. Thank you, Fatima, so I can focus on a face and have a human element rather than blob. So anybody else who wants to turn on their camera, I would greatly appreciate it. Have your sound off, except obviously if you want to ask me a question. Kids might be coming home. There might be feedback, etc., and so on. So sound off, please. Ask questions. Put your virtual hands up. If you've got your camera on, you can wave your real hand around. It may need to start to manage them, or just put questions in the sidebar, the chat, and I will periodically check it. So I'll turn the chat on now so I can see if things start to appear here. So with that, if I can find my cursor, let's get on. So this, as a reminder, we went through this last week. You should all have a much better idea of the NEC 4 family of contracts. And what isn't in there is the facilities management contracts, or suite of contracts, which basically includes these 3 rebranded and in facilities management language, plus a term service short subcontract, or facilities management short subcontract. We've also looked at this slide before, and I just sort of want to just briefly, very quickly go through it, or just draw people's attention to it in terms of when we look at this, or the 6, we're going to look at the first 5 main options under the engineering construction contract, but I'll briefly try and talk about how they vary amongst these ones over the family when we come to them. So an option A under the price contract, under the term services contract, actually is a combination of lump sums-ish and a schedule of rates, if you like, rather than just lump sums activities and so on. If we look at the design and build operate contract, I would now, should it have a sort of amber down there, because it does give you the option to do stuff on input costs, right? But it's a bit of it, right? So anyway, if we carry on, so Also, reminder of the principles of allocation and sharing, and we'll be putting this into effect when we're talking about target cost contracts as well. So just a reminder, this is in them in shorthand, what we need to consider the effect on the organisation's business, with the rule being it's not going to go bank or mustn't become insolvent if the risk or a combination of risks occur. These ones can be lumped together around management, which is the normal popular way of thinking about allocation of risk. But we've got to look at financial capability. All things being equal, who can best positively influence it happening, as in proactively. So proactively preventing a threat type risk occurring, proactively make an opportunity like risk happen. And clarity above for minor risks, with a generally allocating them to the contracting party, because you don't want to have arguments over in NEC speak whether it is or isn't a compensation event, and generally allocating the contracting party, because if they're frequently occurring, you don't want frequent arguments over how much, if you like. You just want them to get on and deal with it. So within the prices, and that's the logical bit, but you've got the cultural bit as well. So moving on to option A contracts. What are option A contracts under NEC? They are activity schedule contracts. Contractor is given in NEC 4 a scope of works to do. It need not be fully defined, as in it could include design and build stuff, but it needs to be sufficiently defined. And effectively, option A, you're saying, I have defined this sufficiently for me to get what I want as a client. I'm going to hand it over to you, and it's a hands-off contracting strategy. So the cooperation, collaboration should be, if you like, around the edges when some inevitable compensation events occur, but there shouldn't be too many compensation events. And what's in the scope, the original scope, that's over to you. I'm giving you a good brief, if you like, and it's up to you to get on to do it. So the contractor takes this scope, breaks it down, does a work breakdown structure, arranges that in a program, but they only get paid for completed activities. So if there's a 3-month earth moving activity in it, or a 3-month whatever activity in it, they would not get paid until they finished that 3-month activity. So what the contractor does is then that Gantt chart, they say, oh, that Gantt chart also has assessment dates going down it. I need to finish each activity by that assessment date. Otherwise, strictly speaking, I'm not going to get paid. If I overrun, I've got to wait until the next assessment date to be paid. So it's not my overall payment that's affected, but my cash flow which is affected. So what they then do is they say, well, I don't want to wait 3 months. Cash flow is important to me. I will break that down into, at most, month-long activities. Now, that's a bit dangerous for a contractor, because if a month-long activity overruns by a month, they've got to finance it for a month. So many contractors, especially as the contract has quite a low threshold for rejigging your activity schedule, so as the time approaches, we'll be looking to break it down to, say, week-long activities, which they can monitor on a weekly basis to say, have I completed it? And if they're getting towards the end of the month and they say, oh, I'm falling a bit behind, they'll put in a bit of extra effort to try and get back on schedule, which a little effort every month is better than a lot of effort at the end of the contract. And even if they don't achieve getting back on track,
that's so interesting.
Someone's got their microphone on. Please turn it off. Thank you. Even if they only achieve 3/4, they still get paid 3/4 of what they planned rather than 0, if you like. But it does encourage. So it's now under the NEC, it is a separate document from the program, but it is drawn from the program. And I think the next slide just illustrates what it will look like if I put it in yet. But so just to illustrate it, here's a very simple activity schedule. I would actually expect, well, it's all right, but the main thing from a contractor's point of view is that, and actually from a project manager's point of view, because you just don't want arguments, is that the end state of the activity is clearly defined. So end state as in, because that's what they get paid for. So activity implies doing an activity schedule, but actually under the contract, it's having finished the activity or completed the activity without defects which delay or immediately covered by following work, or delay or covered by immediately following work that matters. So when I look at this, it's a bit brief on what the completed state is. I would read that to mean all air tests. If that's fine, great, but the contractor might want to be a bit more precise. So based on this, if sometimes what you see is another column, which is off the screen, if you like, and that's a cash flow column. And that is at the end of month one, if you like, if the contractor's on schedule, how much will need to be paid out to them? And contractors obviously are interested in that. Clients with their budgets and having to go back to their finance department and say, we'll need this much money at the end of this month and this much at the end of this month. Finance departments like to know what they're going to be paying out as well. Advantages particularly compared with bills of quantities contracts, is that any significant level of design is more easily accommodated. Design becomes an activity. And we've got Charles asking a question. So, Charles, your hand's gone up. Hello?
Can you hear me?
I can now.
All right, good enough, thanks. The previous slide, I started to find out. So in terms of, yeah, that one. So in terms of paying out, are you going to be paying out by the line item, or is that will be paid both based on what you finished in a month?
It will be paid.
It's
paid. You are so you have your program.
Yeah.
You like visualize it. You have your bars in a program. Each bar has a sum of money attached to it. Yeah. So you'd have a bar for mobilization. That program has those assessment dates going down it. If the contractor completes that bar by an assessment date, it gets paid for it. Strictly speaking, if it overruns by a day, it has to wait for another month to be paid.
Okay, so you have to agree on terms of a date of assessment date.
Well, yeah, assessment dates, yes, early on. You'd so normally in the contract data, assessment dates are stated as being the last Friday of each month or something like that.
Okay, and that's for NEC.
Yeah.
All
okay.
Right.
So we will later on talk about milestones and lump sums. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
So advantages, contractors, this goes back years when I did my research, contractors did do more thorough tenders because they had to look at programs in more detail. And that, they said, gave lower prices, if anything, right? Because they thought it through more. There was less risk as a result. But it is more costly for contractors to prepare. In particular, it is more costly for contractors to prepare if each and every one of them is taking off the quantities, because you cannot get away from the fact that quantity is a component of cost. So many employers, as was clients, do by some means supply approximate quantities with lots of disclaimers on them. Or what happens is they employ a firm of QSs to take off a bill of quantities, report back to them if there's any errors which they spot as they're doing it, but then tell the contractors, oh, this firm of QSs has got a bill of quantities which you can buy from them. And the advantage of that is that if there's any misrepresentation, and I'm not saying fraudulent misrepresentation, innocent well, there isn't innocent misrepresentation or negligent misrepresentation from the client if they get the quantities wrong, because it's not the client who's prepared it. It's the consultants who've exercised reasonable skill and care. So they do a deal with the consultants to prepare it. Contractors get it from them. They get some feedback on the quality of their scope document. Okay. It does give more visible cash flow for both bodies, both compared with bills of quantities, where the contractor's paid quantity times rate, and lump sums, where the contractor is paid a proportion of each bar, if you like, that they've completed. All right. So under JCT, and I believe FIDIC, if you are using a lump sum strategy for payment, the contractor does not have to complete the bar by that assessment date. If to go back to my original example, if they had 3 months earth moving and it was spread over 3 assessment dates, then, and they planned to complete a third, but they only completed 30% of the earth moving at the end of month 1, they'd get paid 30%. Because contractors think more about programming, because there's an incentive to keep to it, because it's explicitly tied to completion of each activity, it's more visible cash flow. More realistic programming and a cash flow incentive to keep to that program. Easier assessment of compensation events versus bills of quantities. Now, you might say, oh yeah, but surely it's any easier just to have a rate for a change. All right. So you want more of that. There's a rate out there which we can either use exactly as is or base it on there. Well, yes, if that's all that it affects, but there is research out there which says a change introduced during the contract typically costs 3 times as much as if it was in the original contract, and 2/3 of that is related to, I'll use the original research, loss of productivity, the disruption, and that's a bar extending, shall we say, and other effects, and the other, just under 1/3, was delay, so the extra time on site. So if you say, well, actually, for a change introduced into the contract, post-contract, typically 2/3 of it relates to the programming impacts, but we're only using the direct cost, we're missing out on 2/3 of the cost. So if this directly correlates with the program, which it's required to do, and people are on top of it, then it should be easier for the tricky ones, shall we say. But potential for rapid assessment is lost. Having said that, people can agree to use rates, lump sums, whatever. Oh, there's a bar for 10 manholes. We want an extra one. Let's just divide it by 10. Yeah. The contract does allow you to do shortcuts. Assessments of the amount due is much easier. You're effectively going, is that activity complete, yes or no, at the end of each month? So I remember one project manager saying it's a half-hour walk around site at the end of each month, compared with when I was on site for a contractor, we would be diverted for a week from doing engineering stuff to doing a measure. On the other side of the road we were building was the clients or the consultant staff doing the measure. We'd mash ours together, or the QSs would mash it together, and then it would be, well, they don't quite match up. So half the time we go out and do a joint survey, and we do that every month. Completely non-value adding activity to the final built asset, if you like. Lastly, before I answer Zach's question, less man hours needed from the start of the contract to the settlement of the final account. So notice what I'm saying there is that, and this is partly due to NEC if operated, I won't say absolutely correctly, but pretty much more correctly. Compensation events should be resolved as you go along. Because of the easy assessment of compensation events, because it's based on program, if you like, there's a correlation with program. The changes are assessed as you go along when people are there, memories are fresh, etc., and so on. and therefore overall there's less time than a big bun fight at the end of the contract. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's less man hours needed to or people hours to administrate and manage the contract during the construction phase. Yeah. And that's one of the things about NEC going back to that stimulus to good project management objective. You are managing the contract rather than just administrating it for a big bun fight, and settling things as you go along. So might well need more man hours during the contract compared with other JCT and FIDIC bills of quantities options, but less overall was my research feedback years ago. Zach, you've been very patient.
Hi there. Thanks for that. Just wanted to ask about the activity schedule. From client perspective, does it, like, every activity needs to have a certain output in order for it to qualify to be payable, or is it just the activity completed?
It's just the activity completed, and by and large, it's the contractor who prepares the activity schedule. So it's in the contractor's interests to have, well-defined activities, so that because if there's a grey area, as they're the one who prepared it, if you like, the grey areas count against them. Yeah, if the client prepared it, the grey areas will count against them. So it's in the contractor's interest to give a good activity schedule. And if you're evaluating an activity schedule at tender and you like the overall price and the contractor and say you've got it, you might say, but we have concerns over the activity schedule in that we think might have arguments over is it completed. So the activities we have concerns over are these. It's not an excuse to change the overall prices or bring forward cash flow or anything, but can you tighten up on those descriptions?
Okay, but I mean, like, for example, like if it's a consultant they need to produce a report. Yes. They are doing the activity towards production of the report, and say it's over 2 months, for example. Yeah. And the first month they spent 50% of the activity program, but the client hasn't yet materialized anything for him. Do they still need to pay half of it? So yeah,
under the professional services, for instance, it would be there needs to be some, if you like, deliverable or something tangible which they can say, look, we have achieved this. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it might be first draft 2, or whatever, first draft. Yeah. Say, okay. Or complete sections 1 to whatever of that report.
Right. Okay. So it needs to be demonstrated something has been completed of the activity, not just we completed half the program, pay half of the money. No, there needs to be result.
Yeah, because otherwise you're going, how do I know what half of the activity is? Particularly, particularly if it's a report. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So a few tips for contractors: make sure all the scope of all the work in the scope is priced up. So you've taken it off, if you like. There are contractors who lost their margin through not doing that. View activities as making up operations in the program. The reason is the contractor has to have method statements for each operation. If activities are viewed as making up operations, there's going to be less method statements and state resource schedules and things like that. And the activities can become part of almost the method statement, a sub bar chart. As I said, make sure the end of each activity is clearly identifiable. You don't want any questions. You just want tick, it's finished. Subdivide activities of a long duration to do that. Split off finishing activities. So, if you like, the 10% which take 20-30% of the time. So if there's one area to focus on, it's break that down. Ensure subcontractors' activities mesh with your own if you're a main contractor, because what you don't want to be doing is paying out subcontractors who've broken one of your main contract activities into 10 sub-activities. You're not getting paid for 2 months, but you're paying your subcontractors. And delivery of major items of plant and materials to the working areas specified as an activity. In fact, I'm just going to go back a couple of slides and just say almost one which I left. Oh, there we go. just point out that activities can include all of these things if you're a contractor. So they don't necessarily need to be a deliverable to the client, but you've done something which is tick-offable. So that's them. I put that in and I'm trying to remember why. Oh, just as a reminder, it can be used for design and build contracts, partly because design can become an activity in itself. It can be used for performance related or specs. I want a power station of X megawatts to produce X megawatts of power. And okay, that is almost up at this level, but they're going to break down what they've got to deliver and we'll get paid for that as the project progresses. If we go to this diagram, we've seen it before, and we'll build up a few things and some nuances here. So what's the difference between a schedule of rates and a bill of quantities? A bill of quantities is essentially used for new build work, and it's where, compared with activity schedules, the client is taking the risk of quantity variation. So in terms of risk allocation, it's more on the client, less on the contractor. Schedule of rates is where is used typically in NEC speak, term services contracts. And that's where it's rather than the contractor just finds it's got to do more work than in the bill of quantities or less work, it's where the work is instructed by the client or their service manager in NEC speak. I want you to do this. Doing this has a standard rate in the schedule of rates. If I instruct you to do 10 of this, I get paid 10 times whatever I've priced for that in the schedule of rates. So bill of quantities contractor finds they're doing the work more or less work than in the bill of quantities. Schedule of rates, typically it's the work is instructed. If we go up to here, fixed price contracts, NEC has activity schedules. Work's got to be completed. The work in the activity's got to be completed for the contractor to get paid. FIDIC and JCT have lump sums. That's where the contractor is paid a proportion of the work covered by that lump sum. And what has disappeared, but used to be in the old GC Works one, is milestone payments. And milestone payments are where the client specifies, if you like, what the contractor is going to get paid. The problem with GC Works, or under GC Works, was you could have a £10 million contract, say, and the client, Defence Estates has become, would specify 10 milestone payments. The contractor would look at it and go, that's not how I would have done the work, but I've now got to arrange my program to, or I'm going to arrange my program, alter my program to try and get the cash flow early on. Not necessarily the best sequence. If there's only 10 milestones for achieving 10 things, and pretty poor programming requirements, then you actually, when change occurs, you have very little flexibility insight, I should say, into how the contractor has costed this thing and how they're incurring costs, which then leads to a huge bun fight around extras, change, because there's no or very little transparency. Now let's apply that to activity schedules, where clients specify the activities. For simple works, such as under the short contract, where especially if they're linear, that might be appropriate. But for works of any complexity, where clients specify the activity schedule, you're in danger of doing the same thing to some degree. Other things that clients do is they limit the number of activities that can be in the activity schedule. I have some sympathy for that, because you don't want it broken down into hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, because you start getting into measuring as you do with bills of quantities, if you like, and that takes up time. But if you or don't allow enough then the contractor will start to amalgamate activities into the ones in the activity schedule. And so let's say, so I had the real life example of a contractor who's saying, look, I've got 250 building operations with subcontractors on this contract, but the client's only allowing me 50 activities in my activity schedule. What do we do? And I said, well, the natural thing you do is you roll them up into one activity, but you only state one of those activities as in one completed thing. Because what you don't want to do is, and I've got 4 on my finger, you know, if you specified all 4 things which were within that, the price for that activity, and you didn't finish one, then you wouldn't get anything. Yeah. On the other hand, it wouldn't be paid anything. But if you just specify one and you finish it, then you get paid for all 5. But again, what happens in that case, the client loses all insight into the prices, etc., for all the other ones which aren't included in the activity schedule, because the contractor doesn't want to not be paid for them. Okay, I hope I've explained that clearly. So getting the right number, whether it's a minimum number or the minimum value, I have some sympathy. I understand why clients do it, but it can't be too small an amount or too small a number. Okay. So any questions on that before we move on to target cost contracts? No, right. Okay. Or cost reimbursable contracts. So I'm leaping over options A and B, if you like, and I'm going to option E, because this is the basis from which target cost contracts are built. So contractor is Charles again.
Sorry, Jen. But I just wanted to find out. So if the main contractor is as the NEC and they have been paid by active they have active schedule, does it mean for the subcontractor, does it mean they automatically also fall under that in terms of they have to get paid under active, or you can agree based on?
Yeah, no, it doesn't. It doesn't. The contractor is in charge of how its subcontracting arrangements. They might look at a subcontractor who says, so they might be under an option A. The subcontractor might be under option B, because the subcontractor says, I'm not taking the risk of quantity variation, in which case the contractor goes, right, okay, how much risk should I add in? Yeah, because there's an opportunity here. If lesser quantities come in, as a main contractor, I'll be quids in. If more quantity comes in and I've got to pay you more, I'll be quids out. So it's part of the contractor's commercial risk around how they subcontract. Okay. Yeah, thanks. Right. Okay. So option E, contractor is reimbursed defined costs. So defined in the contract. So defined in the contract, so we're not arguing over what a cost is and whether it's related to it, how it's built up, etc. Plus a fee, which is expressed as a fee percentage. And for anybody who's familiar with NEC 3 but not necessarily NEC 4, there is only one fee percentage in NEC 4 now. So what does that look at, which is applied to those defined costs? So what does that look like? I'm a contractor. I'm incurring defined cost as the contract proceeds. On top of that, my fee percentage is applied for any other costs which aren't defined costs. So how much do I get paid? I get paid defined cost plus a percentage fee to give my price for work done to date. Okay. Now, I actually said 2 half-truths there. I am actually paid what I have spent plus a forecast to the end of the next month, the next assessment date, so that as a contractor, I should just about be paid by the time I've paid it out. So I should, in the unamended contract, be slightly cash flow positive and then what we do is reconcile it for the next payment. And what I get paid is the amount due, which is largely the price for work done to date, plus any other amounts minus any retention or anything like that. So if you're a contractor, is this a good way to do work? It's a pretty low risk way to do work, isn't it? And in fact, you could argue the more money I spend, if my fee percentage is effectively my margin, my head office overheads and profit, the more money I spend, the more money I make. I love it. Yeah. So first of all, within the contract, there are some disallowed costs, as in if some will be fraud potentially under contract law. If there's defects where they haven't followed a method stated in the scope documents, that's a disallowed cost. Correcting defects after completion, that's a disallowed cost. Not justifying the cost in their accounts and records, that's a disallowed cost. So there are various things which are disallowed cost within the contract. But perhaps the biggest balance is I'm a repeat order client. If you rip me off, I'm not going to use you again. Yeah. That's perhaps the biggest incentive to be responsible as a contractor. But it's not a cost-driven route. So it's used when cost is not the priority. So when time and or quality are. So one of my regular clients is a water company. They use cost reimbursable contracts for emergency projects. They have friendly contractors who know how to do open book accounting for them. A water main blows up. They don't sort of do a survey, put it out to tender, run a competition, then have lots of compensation events because what they've found is different and evolving situation. They just get the friendly contractor in who starts work straight away. All right. And that relates to why is it time driven? Well, actually, it's because it's subject to risk and we don't have time to nail the risk. We've got to get on and do it. Okay. It's not one you necessarily want to be using because of that, because of the risk and the extra costs, but sometimes you have to. The benefits outweigh the drawbacks. Target cost contracts are a development of cost reimbursable contracts. And if you read the contract and the different options, the main payment options, essentially the key difference between a target cost contract and a cost reimbursable contract is the incentive mechanism. There's an extra set of clauses for an incentive mechanism. So during the contract, the contractor is reimbursed their defined cost plus fee as a cost reimbursable contract. The payment terms exactly the same, but at completion, so when the contractor has done enough for the client to use the works or others to come in and use the works, there is a first reconciliation, and essentially you're splitting the gain or the pain at that point. So what does that look like? Here's the defined cost plus fee line. We have a target prices here, which is negotiated, tendered competitively, built up on an open book basis, often in frameworks. And we have a 50-50 split. So this green line bisects the angle, so roughly 50-50. And yippee, at completion, the contractors saved an awful lot of money in this example. In fact, I'd be a bit concerned if this was an absolute scale and they'd save that much money, because clearly the target price was wrong. But up to 10% is a good result. I think more than 10% of savings on the target prices, you have to say, did we use it in the right circumstances? Did we get the pricing right? All right. So if it was on built up on an open book basis, we went wrong somewhere probably. Yeah. But you also have to, going back from that, did we use it in the right circumstances? Should we have used the cost reimbursable contract? So if we move on a slide and disappear, what does that mean? It means that for this 50-50 savings, compared with a cost reimbursable contract, the contractor makes this much extra profit which they wouldn't have done. Compared with a price-based contract, the client gets this share of the savings, which under a price-based contract, they wouldn't see any of it. Yeah. So that's the upside. But hang on, we also share in this profile the downside, the pain share. So here, the client's taking 50% share of the overrun and the contractor's taking 50% share of the overrun. So my ex-professor, John Perry, who was also co-instigator of the NEC, he did a lot of research on these, and he found in his research 2 generic advantages of using target cost contracts. One was the open book accounting led to transparency in other areas, so transparency of programming, transparency of risk, etc., and so on, especially if built up jointly beforehand. And secondly, wherever you are along this line, providing, well, he didn't say this, but providing both parties have a big enough share of any savings, there is an incentive to work together to minimize costs, to move the costs down there. Now, I will add in what I did with my postdoc research, which was the proviso was providing both parties have a big enough share. What you want is a big enough share, so the emphasis is on saving money along this line, not pushing up the target prices, because under option A, the prices is what you will ultimately pay the contractor. Under option the total of the prices in the activity schedule. Under option B, it's lump sums and quantity times rate. Under option C and D, and we'll come to the differences in a moment, it's the fulcrum around which the incentive mechanism operates. Under all those options, it's the prices is adjusted by compensation events, the same compensation events pretty much, with the same process and the same criteria for adjustment. If this is capped, and let's say that green line above the line goes to there, follows that, then actually all the overrun is on the contractor. Even though costs could be down here, if you start forecasting that, then the contractor could go, the client could go, well, I'm going to pay this as maximum because it's capped. Why should I help out the contractor now? The contractor goes, well, if you're not helping me out reduce costs as I anticipated, I'm going to start focusing my efforts on increasing the prices. And then potentially all the other areas in which you want cooperation stroke collaboration start to disappear. So going back to, I think, was it in week 1 when we looked at the Sheffield City in a ring road with that price versus cost contracts and so on, that they didn't cap it, but there was a lot of joint things where they could influence. If they'd have capped it, which would have been in their interest, you could say, at a first level of thinking, because they had a fixed budget from government to build it. But all the cooperation, the stakeholder management, the going the extra mile to keep the client happy could have disappeared. And actually, you could argue when you really want cooperation, collaboration is when things get difficult. Okay. So that, and also just think about it in transfer of risk. If I am capping that here, then the contractor goes, well, I've got all the downside of a price-based contract. If my costs exceed my prices, I'm losing money. But any upside, I'm splitting with you. So I have asymmetric risk. So the net result is a contractor would actually say, I'm going to have a higher target prices than a price-based contract. Because heads I lose, tails I split the gains. All right. So think about that in terms of risk allocation. So they have become almost the go-to arrangement for cooperation or collaboration. There is actually a movement away from them, if anything. And I think that's because use of them became an excuse for poor contract or project management, as in, oh, we won't get a good scope together, we'll sort it out during the contract. Well, if you're sorting it out during the construction phase, that costs money. Yeah. You know, and it will change the prices often because it will be a compensation. Key difference between two options. If go back here, and this is a big one. Under options C and D, both of them, the QSs are counting defined cost as the project progresses. Under option C, though, this price is built up using activities. In theory, in exactly the same way as under option A. Although, because the contractor's paid on this axis, it might not be as broken down as much detail. So this then changes due to compensation events. Under option D, this is actually a running total because it might start here with lump sums, and then as the contractor does work, and if you like, the quantities work start to be done, effectively you start going up this axis. So the QSs, God bless them, effectively have two jobs to do. They have to count the defined cost plus fee, and they have to count the quantities. So they go home at after 5 o'clock, which for a QS, you know, that's late. Okay. That's a joke, by the way. Okay. So it is target cost contracts can be quite burdensome if you don't get the open book accounting right. They can be especially burdensome on option D. And ultimately, the client is paying for it because they're arguably paying for it twice. They're paying for, on an open book reimbursable basis, the contractor's people to administrate them and bring forward the evidence, and then they're paying their own people or other consultants to check on the contractor. So moving on from there, from that one, this is a pain gain profile where the contractor's taking the majority of the overrun. And this is the other one where actually the client said, much like my water company example was, they said, we're a big utility. We pretty much know what money's coming in, year out. Yeah, we spend 300-400 million on construction each year. Are we, in terms of who is best able to take downside risk, we are, yeah, not the contractors. So therefore, if a project goes or a contract goes significantly wrong, in this case it was about plus 20%, we're going to take the majority of the risk. All right. So go back to the insurance effect. We're the insurers, right? Now, if it absolutely followed this line here, was parallel, effectively it would have become a cost plus contract. In this one, it's actually effectively at plus 20%, the contractor loses their margin, their fee percentage. So any contribution to head office overheads and profit has disappeared. And this, the contractor's share matched their fee percentage. So effectively it became at cost for the contractor. So the contractor, that looked bad on profit on turnover. But in that this example, you know, they don't want it to carry on overrunning because they're not making anything on it overrunning. It just makes their profit on turnover look bad. Which brings me on to how do you put these percentages into the contract? So this is an extract from the contract data part 1, the bit that the client fills in, and it talks about share ranges and share percentages. And share ranges are relative to the target prices. Oops. So So the target price is 100%, if you like. Yeah. And the share range is the amount that the contractor gets or takes. So we've got less than, from, and greater than, and the contractor's share percentage. So if I go back to this, at less than 90% of the target prices, the contractor's share percentage, I think from memory, is 75%. So they're getting, in this one, 75% of any gain, but beyond the 10%. from 90% in terms of share range to 120%, the contractor's share percentage was 25% from memory, I think. Right. So initially they take 25% of any gain, which is in the boundaries of a good result. Yeah. But the boundaries of bad result are plus 25%. They're taking 25% of the hit. And then at greater than 120%, the contractor's share percentage match their fee percentage. Okay. So if we think about that, so that's what these means in terms of the entry in the contract. If we think about that a bit more in depth around principles of risk allocation and sharing, I divide it up into 4 groups, or 5 areas, I should say. Zone 1 is, and they all interplay, so you do have to think about the interplay, but zone 1 is effectively a significant overrun. And if the client is much more financially strong, they effectively act as the insurer. They take the majority of the risk. If it's a big contractor and a small client, it might be the other way around. Yeah. So you can quite understand a small local authority gets a big grant from government. If the project overruns, they have to find money from their own back pocket, but they're contracting with a national contractor. You know, it might be the other way. The contractor takes the majority of the share of the overrun. Zones 2 and 3 are within the expected results, if you like, as in zone 1 is when something a collection of risks mean that the project's gone significantly wrong. Who can bear that risk? Zones 2 and zone 3 are who can control these risks. So my starting point will be it's mainly going to be the contractor, because that's why I'm employing them. How much you give them might depend upon how well the project is developed. So, for instance, when I was doing my research, National Power used target cost contracts. They might have, and they would let the contract often when they had met a figure which meant it was commercially viable, if you like. So it might be that they have a pretty loose performance spec, and they know there's loads of fat in there, if you like. In which case they'd say to the contractor, it might be, you're only going to get 20% of any gain because we know there's fat in there. You don't have to work too hard for it. Yeah. On the other hand, at the other extreme, they might go, actually, you've had to work really hard to get it down to the budget figure. It's effectively fully designed. Should we actually bother with a target cost contract? Why not go to a price-based contract? Because it's fully designed. We've de-risked it, etc., and so on. Okay, so think about that. And then zone 4 is the significant underrun. That's a saving beyond what you could contemplate. And generally, I would think that clients want the majority of the savings there. You still want the contractor to have some, because you don't want them to get to 90%. 10% share saving and then just go, it all goes to the client now, why bother? Yeah, you still want enough, if you have overpriced it, if you like, for them to be motivated to continue making savings, but not excess profit, if you like. The last zone, zone 5, is a neutral zone, and that's just a trick if, for instance, in a negotiated environment, you can't match up, and the contractor thinks it should be, say, 105 million, and the client thinks it should be 100 million. You essentially say within that zone, you're going to be relatively indifferent. Your share of any savings will be the same as of any overrun, will be the same as your fee percentage. So it will be in that zone at cost. Yeah. You'll look slightly worse, profit on turnover wise, but in absolute terms, you're going to make the same profit. So that's a negotiate or a ploy when you can't quite close the gap in terms of figures in a negotiated or open book environment. Hopefully you don't use it because you're because you agree, because there's full transparency and you're on the same page, but just if you need to get that last little hum. So I think this is a relatively sophisticated model. There's a paper in it in the International Journal of Project Management, or there's a further explanation in my book. But I do remember going to the NEC Users Conference, and a speaker gave a talk on what they were doing with target cost contracts for a big project, and I can't remember what it was. And someone asked, why did you go 50-50 on the share paying gain profile? And the senior commercial person said, well, couldn't think of what else to do. And I thought, oh my God, is that your level of sophistication of thinking on a, I think it was a couple of 100 million at least project? This adds a bit more sophistication to that, the sharing of risk. And I hope you see how it relates to that. So so there are drawbacks to target cost contracts, and this is why they're being used less, I think. Target does still need to be adjusted, and in the ECC, the clauses for adjusting the prices are core. All right. So people forget that the pinch point in the relationship is the adjustment of targets. Yes, there is a joint incentive to make savings, but you still need to manage the prices through compensation events. And people forget that actually, if you don't sort out stuff pre-contract and they are the change or whatever comes under a compensation event heading, it is a compensation event. Not, oh, we'll just sort it out because we're working together. Well, if it's a compensation event, arguably the paying gain share doesn't apply until it's incorporated, until that compensation event's agreed. So the contractor naturally wants to maximize it. The client side naturally want to minimize it. Going back to my professor's research here, when he found it was being used, he also found that where it was used was in less extreme circumstances to cost reimbursable contracts, where you could say it's about that much. And depending on whether you were going it's about that much or that much would affect how much paying gain you allocate. So one of the things is it did create or does create the motivations for cooperation and collaboration, but that does mean that someone's got to be there to cooperate or collaborate. One of the areas where they should be used is where both parties can contribute to the risk, the uncertainty within the prices. So going back to my Sheffield Inner Relief Road, that's a prime example. The contractor could come up with the whiz-o-wheeze ways in which they could build it better, faster, etc., through methodology, but it was the client, the council, which had all the stakeholders and could communicate with them the relationships, etc., to put those into effect. If the client either isn't there can't cooperate, isn't there to cooperate, doesn't have the capability, or the project just doesn't have the potential, the risk within the prices to cooperate to manage out threat, managing risk, then arguably the gain share which the client takes is just lost profit to the contractor. And as a result, they just have a higher prices than on that design and build, because it goes back to that asymmetric risk bit. Right. So you do need, particularly if it's based on collaboration, a client involvement to be there. The other aspect where greater client involvement or client side involvement is needed is the administration of open book accounting. This morning I was watching a webinar on auditing. I think it should go back further than that, and actually fair play, he did. But you need to get up to speed on the financial systems. The contractor needs to have good financial systems to, as what he called the first line of defense. Do the contractor systems work well? Are they up to it? The line two is of defense, as he put it, is the QS side, the site establishment, the project team, if you like, need to understand it, be on top of it, etc. Not ask for too much because it becomes big bureaucratic. And then the level 3, line 3 of defence is what the speaker was talking about mainly, which is the independent audit of it. So there is that extra cost in there. I think it started to go down where after they came in because people got used to it. I now think there's a bit of a cottage industry in administrating cost-based contracts where, and apologies to all the consultants out there who work for QS firms, where they make a meal out of it and then they can sell more bodies and then they find stuff and then they justify selling more bodies and we need more. Okay. But regardless of that, small contracts, one-off contracts might not be economical. So key implementation points for target cost contracts. Use them in the right circumstances when there is, which in a collaborative environment is when there is risk and uncertainty within the target prices, which both parties can contribute to, whether it's managing out downside risk or managing an opportunity. Make sure the components of the target are realistic. So my professor's research said make sure the target is realistic, because as with all incentive mechanisms, the starting point has to be realistic. My refinement was make sure the components which are realistic. So make sure the fee is realistic, make sure the defined cost bit is realistic, make sure the risk allowances are realistic. I could do an it worked example from my head, right? But it is always in the contractor's interest to have if you like, artificially deflate the defined cost and risk elements and increase the fee bit to arrive at the same prices. Intelligently set the share profile to reflect the risk profile of the contract and align objectives as much as you can. Specify, agree audit requirements up at the start. And I could say a lot more on that, but I'm not. And that means ensure the good financial management systems are in place. And then you need the right quantity and quality of staff to actually administrate it. Okay. It does, as one people said, calls for a high level of professionalism. So to summarize where we are so far, this is my sort of, I've borrowed it from Glenn Hyde, another NEC geek, but it's a fairly common one. This is the risk profile of when you use them. Okay, so what's the time? Time is battery low. My watch is about to conk out, so I'm trying to find the time. 17:34. Pause for reflection. Just a little time. I think we're going to any clarifications or amplifications. First of all, anything which I've said where you go, now that you give me a pause for thought, I just want a bit more on that, or I didn't actually understand what you were saying, and what didn't you know or fully appreciate that you do now know. Right, okay, if I can get that. All right, put in the chat or be brave and give a bit of feedback. Okay, so I'll give you a minute to do that, a little bit of reflection time, and if people want to put stuff up, that'd be great. If you don't, I'll just crack on. So Oliver has said, is it fair to say that a target cost contract requires a much more intelligent client than an activity schedule, as this involves assessing and setting the target cost? Pre-contract, yes, probably does. You can still do, open book a tender, but generally I would say well, actually, when you consider frameworks, you might be getting up, and this is off the top of my head, 70 or 80% to 80% are negotiated, built up on an open book basis, I would say. And that, if that's done openly, that then has benefits once the contract is let, because the client side understand the costs. So when compensation events do occur, they've got much more insight into the change, but also they know what's driving the contractor. So yeah, I think it is fair to say that.
Thank you.
Yes, for emoji, I think a lot of people don't. Right? Okay. I think, yeah, and I think that a lot of clients, you can get a lot of benefit out of them if done well. Don't get me wrong. A lot of benefit if done well. I don't see them, and I do see some clients doing them well. Don't get me wrong, but I see a lot not being done well. I think they've definitely been overused, shall we say, and the fashion stroke trend has passed a little bit, and they're on the decline. Which is not to say they're still going to be a significant feature for big projects, big risky projects. But they're hopefully used a bit better. Zach, you've got your hands up. If we take this and then we'll move on.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the general principle of risk allocation in general. Like, say for instance, a contractor on ECC, they are doing certain work on, say, doing investigation work on a bridge. They went on site and they found out, for example, unpredictable case or situation where there is utilities, for example.
Yep.
How would you approach usually, like how does these cases will be approached, saying, is this risk that the client need to has ownership of?
So it would vary depending on two things. One is if it's a design and build job and the contractor is doing the design, if you like, then it could only be a compensation event under 60.112, which is the compensation event for physical conditions. So there, the words are, there is subjectivity in them. Would it be a physical condition which an experienced contractor at the subcontract date would have judged to have such a small chance of occurring that it would have been unreasonable for it to have allowed for them? So there's subjectivity in those words. It's clarified to some extent by the contract states what information they need to have taken into account, but it's still a subjective call. So if it's completely out of the blue, no one expected it, yes, it would be a compensation event. If it's, well, we didn't know it was there, but we knew it was somewhere around. That's a judgment call. If, on the other hand, it was a client design job and their design didn't work, then the client, through their project manager, would have to change the scope, and that is a compensation event. So, but what you're highlighting there is one of the things we'll look at in subsequent ones is you can all, if I was to go back and put up that slide on the process of developing the contract strategy, is the fine tuning. And in that box, I said something like add or subtract compensation events. So the client could say, actually, I'm going to delete the physical conditions compensation. Okay, you'll get a higher prices, you'll get more certainty, but are you prepared to pay for that certainty?
Right. Okay. So it really depends on whether it's predictable or not predictable for the contractor to.
Yeah.
To
yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And if it's unpredictable, the client pays for it. If it's not,
in the unamended contract with clause 60.112, the compensation rent for physical conditions still in there.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Right. I'm going to move on to early contractor involvement. So, first of all, if you are really interested in early contractor involvement, two things. One is I did do a webinar, which is up on my website. So www.johnbroom, and go to videos, and it's somewhere down there. And that's a 45-minute talk, which amplifies on these slides. If you're really interested in early contractor involvement in the new year, along with two others, I've got a book coming out on it. on early contractor involvement. So this is a real zoom through it. So what is ECI? It's early contractor involvement. Or why ECI? Why do it? Well, it's this diagram. It doesn't make, when you look at it logically, does it make sense to get involved, the party who's going to spend 85, 90% of your costs on a contract, when effectively they're already committed because you've made all the big decisions here, yeah? Why not get this person in here when they can add the most value? That's the case. That's the case for it. To quote Boris Johnson when I gave the talk, I think, the cost is baked in, yeah? You're like, when you let it, if you haven't got them involved before. The biggest downside, though, so the more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. The project, the more this becomes true, the more you want to add the value up front. But the biggest why not is because loss of competitive pressure to agree the target prices or the budget. So we'll come on to what the budget is. All right. So what does that imply? It implies you really need to nail down how this is done as a contractual obligation. So if you're going to appoint a contractor basically on consultancy rates and a fee percentage, you really need to nail down, as I think Moji was probably getting at, how you're going to agree those prices. How are you going to price for the risks? How are you going to, what are you expecting to see? What's the process going to be? Not to the nth level of detail necessarily, but sufficient detail that you're gonna have comfort. So here's the headline types, and I won't dwell on them. I'll just go into them. So type 1 and type 2 are early in contractor involvement under 2 contracts, and stage 1 is using a professional services contract and paying on a time charge basis. Stage 2 is typically a target cost contract, but it's a new contract. Okay. Why type 1 and type 2? Type 1 is effectively where the client is still has responsibility to develop the design, and therefore the contractor is providing advice only. So don't design it like that, design it like this. Yeah. Whereas type 2 is where the contractor is actually, or what will become the contractor, they're a consultant under the professional services contract, is actually responsible for doing the design. Okay. And they will inherit the design that they do, I would strongly suggest, becomes their responsibility under the contract. So if there's ambiguities or mistakes in their design, they are responsible for that ambiguity. It's already within the option C prices to cover that. Whereas, so stage 1 would typically be professional services short contract because it's advice. All right. Coming on Monday, every Monday for clinics with a design team, and you can review what they've done and make suggestions, and they can ask you questions. Type 2 is where you're actually developing an ECI. You generally tend to use them for VUCA-ish type projects. There actually is a professional services contract. You've got a deadline, you've got a date, they're managing the resources. Type 3 is classic ECI, and by that, it's where the secondary option X22 of the engineering construction contract is used. So the X clauses are what we're going to look at in subsequent courses. And X22 is fairly late, high numbering because it was added on. It wasn't in the original contracts. Is added on. And what happens is effectively you do stage 1 on a cost plus basis. So as a cost reimbursable contract. And then you have a break or notice to proceed, and it transforms into a target cost contract where that target includes the costs incurred in stage 1. Okay. And that's normally for detailed design and construction. Trend, I would say, again, with people getting away from target cost contracts being used, oh, we'll be collaborative and not do good contract management. The trend is more towards definitely the design becoming almost done in stage one. So type 1 and type 2, it's two separate contracts. For stage 1, a consultancy contract, and stage 2, a target cost contract. This is one contract with a break clause. So when to use type 3, when the design development is reasonably complex versus type 1, and you to anticipate a reasonable amount of additional site investigation or enabling work in stage 1. So the disadvantage of stage 2, or the advantage of stage 2, is there's a new contract. You don't have to, the contract comes to end and then you have to sign a new one. That's an advantage, right? The disadvantage is it's a contract for professional services. So if you want physical works to be done, like site investigation or enabling works to take things off the critical path and de-risk it, under a professional services contract, that doesn't really cover it. So you either got to put into a parallel physical contract or not do it, right? Whereas this allows it to be done. And later types are unsuitable. So type 4 is early contractor involvement with an option E contract. It's again with X22, so the standard clauses allow for it. And stage 1 is again done on a cost plus basis, all right? And potentially similar circumstances, but stage 2 has a higher level budget, right, and fewer compensation events effectively, which adjust that budget. All right. Now, in the unamended contract, there is only gain share around that budget. In other words, if you overrun the budget, the contractor overruns the budget, all the pain is on the client. Where it's entered into is when it's entered into earlier as there's more risk. So if we just look at this, you've got a contract budget which has fewer, it includes client costs as well. So land take, for instance. So now, because there's a pay and gain share around that, around client costs, the contractor is motivated to minimize the client costs, not just their own costs. All right. So they're looking at it more as a project basis rather than my contract basis. And the pay and gain, as I said, split in whatever proportion you state. But in the unamended contract, this follows that. So all the costs goes on there. Just to add in something which I think I'm just briefly mentioned, but as well as including client costs over and above what's in a target cost contract, there's also far fewer reasons to adjust that budget compared with the prices. What does that mean? It means that when a problem occurs, rather than the contractor potentially going, oh, it's a compensation event, let's focus on or devote some effort to pushing up the target prices, they now go, providing they're in this range, they now go, well, there's no adjustment to the budget, so we might as well get on and minimize it. So it promotes collaboration, and it promotes collaboration around what's important to the client, which is their budget. All right. Now, when you start to get into the detail, clients go, well, actually, why shouldn't they just have upside? Why can't they have some downside? So they share the downside. The contractor then goes, well, okay, but some of those things aren't actually in my control. So I'm a bit unwilling to share costs, pain for things which aren't in my control. So if you take those things out of my control, then we can have a lower budget. And you start to actually get away from one of the things which makes it really attractive to clients, which is it's my budget. Yeah. because there are other things included, and you can start with negotiations to go back towards a target cost contract. So it on the surface it's very attractive. It's you know, in reality it's not quite as attractive. When to use type 4 between sophisticated clients and contractors who can get a handle on the risks being added onto the prices to arrive at the budget, what would normally be compensation events or jointly held or joint risks, which implies a degree of repetition in the nature of works being done. Otherwise, the risk amounts are just guesses. And an ongoing relationship, i.e. a framework. And frameworks, normally there's a degree of repetition. Type 5 is option A, and this is becoming more, it's not as written, and that's why it's an amended X22. And essentially stage 1 is the early contractor involvement bit, and stage 2 is let under an option A contract. And you could argue, if the purpose of ECI, early contractor involvement, is to de-risk the contract, if you've done it really well, why not let it as an option A contract? I think I've got one which is just about to be put out to tender now, and that's for a building and a refurbishment of the M&E in a built building. And there I can quite see it, because actually a building's a contained unit. They should be able to de-risk it, yeah. But for a civils contracts where there's rain, weather, physical conditions, etc., and it's long and stretched out, even with ECI or a lot of ECI, you know, has it been sufficiently de-risked, especially if it's a big contract? Okay, sufficiently to go option A, perhaps not. So that's becoming back in, but it's not as written. And then okay, and then the last one is one which is Perth and Kinross Council is a good example. Target prices tendered by the contractor in competition. Stage 1 is that there's a big emphasis on you've got to get strong permission. The real intention is you don't do works in stage 1. If you are, you've got to get the project manager's permission. But we've got a big phase where you can value engineer de-risk. Any savings made in stage 1 are, if you like, are kept. You know, they don't adjust the prices for stage 2. So it really gives the contractor and the client working with them a really good opportunity and the incentive to take out costs. If those things, if compensation events happen there, but in that stage 1, then they can be compensation events, yeah. So it can go up. So you go, hang on, this is all upside for the contractor. Compensation events generally push it up, but all savings, you know, they get a share of. But what happens is when you let go into stage 2, if you like, what happens is there's a lot of risk transfer onto the contractor. So if you like, they take all responsibility for not just the design they've done, but the client's design. Now, if the client changes that, that's a compensation event. But they're taking responsibility for all the scope. They're taking responsibility for the physical conditions as per the break point, not going back to when they tendered, yeah. So if they don't get so there's a much reduced scope for compensation events in stage 2. So more risk is transferred compared with classic ECI. So pros and cons in the slide. Most amendments are needed to it compared with other forms, and therefore contractors need reassurance. On the Perth and Kinross where we did it, we certainly needed to bring the contractors along with us, and the client did a very good job of that. We're not going to do management contracts because we've overrun otherwise, so we'll do these next time, and we'll do that. It is 1756. Biggest aha moment from today. Would be good if I could have a quick feedback before we close out. So is anybody willing to either wave their hand or put something in the chat box? It appears. Oh, Oliver,
Well, yeah, I didn't realize that there was contract options for ECI and that it was much more than just getting a friendly contractor on board to have a chat at the design phase. That was a big aha moment. Right.
Okay. Well, that's a good one. Yeah. Yeah, it's a maturing option, if you like. Yeah. But there's sub options within it. And as with contract strategy, there's pros and cons of every contract strategy. And what you're trying to do is get the optimal given the contract circumstances. If you're a black and white thinker, if you like, contract strategy is not for you. If you like, oh, a bit of that, added a bit of this, then it becomes more for you. And I'm like that. Right. Okay. Do you tend to both to comply with public right? Yes, you do. You have to state what the rules are to enter into. Well, you have to be clear with it on the tendering rules. Okay. And you have to include legal words if you're not to proceed. One of the things which they did in the latest version D, if you like, of the ECC was tighten up the words, which I would normally add in words because I wasn't happy, but they tightened up the words for if you didn't go to stage 2 with that contractor, the reasons for terminating, not paying excessive amounts and being able to get someone else in. So that's in the contract, but otherwise you'd have to write words around that. So yeah, you do have to comply for both stages. It's one procurement, if you like. Okay. Any others? Any other? Right. Well, we'll finish. Well, actually, I did my last slide. So what we're going to do, just to confirm, next time we'll do those management contracting slides, which we didn't get through. And then what we'll do is we'll start focusing on the secondary options. I'm not going to do them linearly as in X1, X2, X3. There'll be an element of that, but what I'm going to do is group them. So where similar options have the same function or are related to each other, we'll group them together and then talk about them as a group, rather than just go X1, X2, X3, X4. Okay. So with that, I'll sign off for the week.